a lot of what's happening now in the Democratic Party is that we're enacting elite style culture without even knowing it. And we're calling people names like that we're the sophisticated globalists and they are the reactionary ethno-nationalists, and that there's no difference between being patriotic and being white supremacist nationalist. And that is the kind of analytical error that we're paying a very, very high price for.
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
I am so pleased to introduce tonight's speakers. Joan C. Williams is an award-winning scholar of social inequality. She is the author of The White Working Class and has published on class dynamics in the New York Times, The Washington Post, The Atlantic, The New Republic, and more. She is Distinguished Professor of Law and Hastings Foundation Chair Emerita at the University of California College of the Law, San Francisco. She's joined in conversation tonight by James T. Kloppenberg, Charles Warren Research Professor of American History, just across the street at Harvard University. Tonight, Joan C. Williams is presenting her new book, Outclassed: How the Left Lost the Working Class and How to Get Them Back. Is there a single change that could simultaneously protect democracy, spur progress on climate change, enact sane gun policies, and improve our response to the next pandemic? Yes, changing the class dynamics driving American politics. The far right manipulate class anger to undercut progressive goals, and liberals often inadvertently play into their hands. In Outclassed, Williams explains how to reverse that process by bridging the diploma divide while maintaining core progressive values. She offers college-educated Americans insights into how their values reflect their lives and their lives reflect their privilege. Michelle Lamont writes, quote, "This effective, well-written, and thoroughly researched book asks a simple question. How can middle-class liberals and progressives bridge the divide separating them from the non-college educated and move the American political needle?" Williams mobilizes wisdom, expertise, and impeccable political instincts to show the way and address a pressing need. This is why Outclassed urgently deserves your attention. We're so pleased to host this event here at Harvard Bookstore tonight, and to Cambridge Forum for filming with us tonight. Please join me in welcoming Joan C. Williams and James T. Kloppenberg.
Thank you, Elliot. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you to all of you for coming out on this dreadful night. This is one of the worst nights we've had in Cambridge for a long time, but every day seems to be a worse day for the United States than the day that came before, so perhaps this is no surprise. It's a treat for me because I am one of the many charter members of the Joan Williams fan club. We met back in the last century when I had read one of her early law review articles called Deconstructing Gender. And I taught some of Joan's work in my classes at Harvard for 25 years. So there are thousands of Harvard students who are familiar with the maternal wall, the ideal worker, and a number of other ideas that I like to think helped shape their lives. Joan is the author of more than 100 law review articles, and those articles have made her one of the most cited law professors in the United States. Tonight we're here to talk about her new book, and rather than continuing myself to compliment her, as I could easily do for a half hour, I will begin with a couple of questions that might carry the conversation forward.
But before you do, Jim, I'm going to embarrass him, so just brace yourself. The reason that this book exists is because Jim invited me in 2009 to give the Massey Lectures in American Civilization. And up to that time, I had been a gender scholar and was soon to transition to studying race. I didn't know that at the time, but I had always talked about class dynamics because I have lived these class dynamics. But it was because of those Massey lectures that were entitled "Obama Eats Arugula" that I started down this path. So I just wanted to thank you.
It was a unanimous decision on the part of the Warren Center Committee to invite you, so I was glad I was able to play a small part in that. That actually does lead to the first question I want to ask you. As somebody who made her name doing gender studies and wrote several, not just path-making articles, but books, including Unbending Gender, which is the book I usually had my students read. How did you move from that? How and why did you move from that to the study of race and class as well as gender?
Well, I always say I've done nothing but me-search my whole life. I started studying gender because I was of that generation of professional women where gender was just completely determining what was happening in my life. It was completely shaping my family life in a way that shocked and dismayed me, frankly. Having married someone who thought he was a feminist, and I thought he was a feminist, and it was it very profoundly shaped my work life, because I met with what I now call the 5 patterns of racial and gender bias. I met with most of them and proceeded to name them all. So the first part of my career, I got really het up about motherhood. I just thought, like, the social construction of this role, to use a technical term, sucks. And I love kids. I loved being a mother. And I thought that the way that it was constructed socially was, as I said at the time, bad for women, worse for men, and worst of all for children. And also at that time, mothers were being fired and told that it was because they were mothers. And federal courts were saying that that was not sex discrimination. And I'm going like, yes, it is. And so I basically transitioned from being a gender theorist to, at that point, under the influence of Jim and others, to become an activist in the sort of John Dewey, Jane Austen. I always think of my career as how to do things with words. And so that was a big chunk of my career. But at a certain point, I had transitioned enough so that I was focused on not the challenges that women face surrounding motherhood, but the challenges that women faced in the workplace, even senior women, and began to read social psychology. I'd sort of started out in theory and history, but began to read social psychology and hang out with social psychologists. This was partly because I had organized them to study gender bias based on motherhood, which turned out to be the strongest form of gender bias that nobody was talking about. And then, so I began to, in a sort of evidence-based way, look at gender bias in the workplace. And at a certain point, I realized that I wasn't studying gender bias. I was studying white women because I'm a white woman. I have the networks that everybody, we have all mini-me networks, most of us. And so I said, I'm not really interested, in white women. I'm interested in gender. And so then I started a series of 9 studies of racial and gender bias, the parallels and the divergences. And in the way I usually do, kind of coined an easy phrase and heuristic for talking about it. But throughout this whole time, I was also thinking about social class, because I married a guy over 45 years ago whose father was a factory worker in Waterbury, Connecticut, who never made over $12,000 a year. And I start out the book telling a story of when, just up here in our apartment in Somerville, when we were at Harvard Law School, his parents were visiting us for the first time. And it was just weird. I mean, they didn't do what I thought parents did. First of all, they stayed at our house. Like, my parents would never have stayed at our house. And secondly, we didn't go out to a restaurant. It's like, who even does this? And then we all washed the dishes together. And I'm going like, whoa, I'm in a different universe. And my mother-in-law came up to me and said, where do you keep the butter? And I said, like, what does she think? I'm a Martian? I said, under the bed. She put the butter under the bed. And then I realized, wait a minute, I think she's a Martian. She thinks I'm a Martian. And that is what I eventually christened and is now taught as the class culture gap. And I realized, reading Pierre Bourdieu, unreadable, by the way, really smart guy, unreadable. but incredibly important, because what he points out is that class is expressed not only through economics, but through cultural differences. And I was living those cultural differences every single day. And I realized eventually that I actually wasn't interested in gender. I was interested in social inequality. And I was interested in the structures of social inequality, and especially the interaction between the different vectors of race, class, and gender, and how people used their access of privilege to try to protect themselves from the consequences of their access of disadvantage. And that a lot of people who study just race or just class or just gender we're not interested in fundamentally the only thing that has ever interested me, which is incommensurate truths held very sincerely by people who are sincere people who just don't get each other.
Okay, thank you. Elliot set up the book very nicely with his opening remarks, and Joan and I had agreed that I should begin my comments with an anecdote. Last month, I was at the annual conference of the Organization of American Historians. Professors from all over the country who teach American history come together and talk about how things are going and give papers to each other. And at the opening session, which the president of the organization had called to discuss the challenges that were coming from the presidential administration to the history profession, he asked if, among other questions that he asked, if anybody on the panel thought that people in the academic world had done anything to provoke these hostile responses. And with one single exception, every member of the panel said that's not possible. Everything we do is simply telling the truth. And I had already read Joan's new book, and so when I had conversations with people, I would say, do you think it's possible that we don't quite understand the people who are so angry with us? And to a person, my friend said, no, it's not that. Don't even think about going there. Which brings me to my next question. How can those of us in our world stop condescending to people who inhabit another world?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is such a good question and rarely asked, so thank you for that. The way I think about it is that when you think about how we were raised, most of us in this room, the focus was on self-development. And not to get all Marxian on you, but that's what our jobs require, right? Our jobs require us to be at the top of our game. So we are very focused on self-development. Also, we feel entitled to self-development. So we're under pressure and we feel entitled. That's a powerful mix. We also, by the way, pressure our children to self-develop. And this is one of the effects of neoliberalism on elites that has received far too little attention. I mean, Michael Sandel's work he's done wonderful work talking about the perversion of the ideal of meritocracy. But the precarity that neoliberalism visited on what I call the missing middle, the middle 50%. We'll talk about how that impacted the middle 50%, but the way it affected elites was this hydraulic pressure on children, which as is now well documented, incredibly bad for them. So we're focused on self-development as kind of the central logic of life. And I always think about this in terms of, sort of the status literature, in terms of the sort of scrum for social honor. I mean, everybody needs a stable standard of living. Everybody needs social honor. So our move in the scrum for social honor is that we're very proud of being members of a globalized elite. Globalized is in there, but we do what all people do. We stress the vector of social power that makes us look good. We're elite. We're stressing class, our class membership. And our style I've thought a lot about this. I mean, our style, of course, we're all, articulate. That's one of the nicest things you can say about things. But we're also, we really highly value sophistication. Now, when Bourdieu was writing Distinction, which is where my work comes from, in the 80s, in France, there was still very different high and low style cultures. So, if you were high, you played tennis and you listened to classical music and all the rest of it. And if you were low, you had a very different set of tastes and preferences. What happened after that in the United States and elsewhere is that the distinction between high and low culture became sort of bled out as people who were fancy decided that they also loved the blues and maybe not country music, but the blues and and pink flamencos and loud plaids, right? But they were not the same as those below because their pink flamencos were put into the yard with irony. And so irony is the way that we reinscribe that high and low culture distinction that is so important for enacting class status. And so that is very central to our taste culture, sophistication, articulateness, irony. So that's us. That's the water we swim in. Maybe not you. Tell you, certainly me. By the way, I've invented a quiz. I really encourage you to take it. It's called it's classbubblequiz.com. In 10 questions, it will tell you whether you're in this middle class or whether you're in the top 20%. Me, as I always say, silver spoon girl, I got 100% elite. But if that's a very, the water we swim in is really different from, I'm not talking about low income people here, the bottom 30% by household income. I'm talking about the middle, what Theda Skocpol brilliantly called the missing middle, because we often forget them in political science, which is where I seem to have ended up right now. Their central value is self-discipline. And of course, this comes right from Michel Lamont's work. And it's really the kind of self-discipline that gets you up on time, without an attitude, every day, to a blue or pink or routine white-collar job that doesn't give you self-development. That's just not an offer. But in order not to get fired, you have to show consistent self-discipline. And so that's the central logic of life among middle status people. And they also highly value the institutions that anchor self-discipline, religion, the military, traditional family values. I mean, one interesting thing when you look at class and gender simultaneously is that middle status people have more traditional gender attitudes than elites do. And again, it makes perfect sense. Those are social ideals they can enact, gender ideals, in the same way that they can't enact class ideals. So again, they're playing off their axis of privilege to make up for their axis of disadvantage. Their moves in the scrum for social honor are, for example, they're much more patriotic than elites are. Just as we stress our high status membership, we're members of the globalized elite, they stress that they're proud Americans. That's one of the major high status categories that they inhabit. And in ways we could talk about more, their lives also are very rooted and they're very place loyal. One easy way to understand this is that, my social honor is completely portable. I can show up in Korea, I can show up in Denmark. I'm for some reason big in Korea and Denmark, figure that out. But I'm who I am. But among, if you're the guy who sells toilets, I always give this example, you want to stick around and hang out with the people who know you're not just the guy who sells toilets. So that's one of the reasons they're very rooted, very place loyal. And then there's all the work family stuff where grandma's taking care of the the kids. And so, and their taste culture also is very different. What we see as, I always think of Elizabeth Warren, like I'm total Elizabeth Warren plan. I mean, I'm a predictable white girl. I love Elizabeth Warren. I have a plan for that. That is read as condescending. And that is not the way blue collar people talk. They really value authenticity. They value sincerity, not irony, sincerity. They value direct talk. So I think of Gretchen Whitmer, of like, fix the damn roads. I'm going, thank you. You know how to talk to people. And you know who else talks that way? Donald Trump. Donald Trump. In a very, very analytical and self-conscious way, the Rupert Murdoch empire has learned how to connect with blue-collar style culture. And so a lot of what's happening now in the Democratic Party is that we're enacting elite style culture without even knowing it. And we're calling people names like that we're the sophisticated globalists, and they are the reactionary ethno-nationalists, and that there's no difference between being patriotic and being white supremacist nationalist. And that is the kind of analytical error that we're paying a very, very high price for.
Okay, this next question actually comes from my entering this world from the world of your in-laws. I grew up in a family that had a sheet metal shop. My father wore bib overalls his entire life, except when he went to church. I worked weekends and summers with guys who had the same job for 30 years and didn't aspire to anything else. They had a good middle-class life back in the 50s and 60s and 70s. One of my brothers still ran that shop until he retired a couple of years ago. And so the question for me, and this is a very real personal question, is how do we build bridges from the world we now inhabit back to the world, or forward to the world, of the majority of people with whom we have a very difficult time communicating?
Yeah. I mean, I think a very simple thing is we stop calling them
without abandoning our
without abandoning our values, without
That's
becoming
important.
Republicans light, because
Right.
life's too short. That ain't gonna happen. I mean, we could stop calling them stupid. That would be really helpful. I mean, there were two incidences in the New York Times recently where Nicholas Kristof wrote an article talking about the pain of the working class. And there was this flood of angry, bitter, accusatory letters saying, you know, these people are pathetic, they are stupid, why should we pretend they're not stupid? These aren't direct quotes, but that was the sentiment. And the Paul Krugman wrote two articles. One of them was kind of deriding rural areas that had voted for Trump and saying that they were just takers and they were getting disproportionate amount of their of government support, and that the red states were sucking all the government support and whining about it the whole time. And why didn't they just? I mean, just the tone of these things, just unbelievable. So we could stop. I mean, excuse me, but doing that is just politically stupid. If you want to help the far right, this is a great formula. But I mean, quite apart from that, I mean, it's funny, I was mentioning to Jim and Mary that on book tour, I mean, I've been in environments where people were saying, yeah, they're dumb and stupid and she's rich and stupid. So, you know, you hang out with people who are disenfranchised and sometimes you get treated the same way. So, I mean, that's just part of the job description. But, you know, people don't like this talk. So that's one. And then the other thing, though, is a lot deeper. And I think about this, I've been thinking about this recently in terms of a story. I actually spent a lot of the last 10 years doing DEI work and just had an NSF grant pulled and supported my institute in DEI consulting. And it's like not a pretty picture and it's intense, let me tell you. But one of the last bias trainings I gave was in a big tech company, and I was in a room of like 200 people. And we do this very much with the data. All you have to do is present the data. The data is so ugly, folks. You just present the data in a dispassionate fashion. People go, oh, that's ugly. And so I was just presenting the data to these tech guys, and I finished, and I was taking off my lavalier, and I handed it to the tech guy, who was probably the only Black person in the room. And he said, Professor Williams, I really have to thank you. He said, I've never felt so seen. And I thought, you know what? This is one of the best days of my career. That is an amazing testament. That's what we have to do to these people in the middle. These people who are voting for Trump, these people who sometimes say the most outrageous racist things. By the way, I studied racism among elites. There's a lot of racism everywhere, folks. We can't displace blame from racism on there. We're not going to, racism is an agenda, that we're not going to back off of. I mean, a lot of the people who are in the sort of let's reconnect with non-college voters are saying either focus exclusively on economics and don't talk about cultural issues at all, or follow the lead of the working class on cultural issues. Well, there's a big chasm between the cultural commitments of elites and the cultural commitments of the middle. And to say to the solution for the Democratic Party is for elites to adopt the traditionalist cultural values of the middle, that's just not coalition building. That ain't gonna happen. That's not gonna work. On the other hand, there's a lot of research that shows that college-educated elites are, in general, 25 points more liberal than non-college voters. And progressive activists, which is like my land, are like 8% of the population. And we tend to be much, much more educated, much whiter, and we're certainly much more class privileged than the average voter. And so I think one of the sort of harder messages to hear is that, I know what I believe as a progressive, and that isn't, those are my values, and that's what defines us. Our values define us. But to insist that the Democratic Party enact only our values at all times, number one, we're doing that. It's not working for us, is it? It's the short road to fascism. But number two, it's really an exercise of racial and class privilege to do that. Because, Black people are much more likely to be moderates than other groups. People of color they don't have the same values as we do as a group, partly because like 79% of Latinos lack college degrees. And as you know, there was, after the 2016 election, many of us said, well, that was just all about racism. And there were lots of studies that showed that, racial bias was the strongest predictor of Trump voting. It took me quite a while to figure out, since I'm not a regression person, that's just regression analysis. What that shows is that if you are racist, you will vote for Trump. Very, very likely. Very likely. Great predictor. But that's not enough votes to win. That's not a large enough vote share. Thankfully, that there are not enough people who are, upfront and out and proud racists to win. The reason that Trump wins is that he also gets a much larger group of people whose racial attitudes don't differ that much from non-Trump voters. And those people are really, really angry about class. And the reason they're angry about class, again, it goes back to neoliberalism. For some reason, we thought it was a great idea to put the poorest people in the world in competition with American middle-class workers. And we thought that was going to work out great. Well, it worked out great for shareholders. It did not work out great for American workers. In the decades after World War II, wages used to rise when productivity did. They kind of kept, they rose in sync. Then if that had continued, wages would be 43% higher than they are today. Virtually all of the job growth in the 15 years before Trump's first election was in gig work and short-term jobs. The reason these people are angry is because they've gotten screwed. Now, they are not directing their anger, in my opinion, at the people who screwed them. And what far-right populism does is it connects with that economic anger, and it deflects it away from economic elites onto cultural elites and political elites. The move for the left is to take that economic anger, direct it back at economic elites, acknowledge the anger against political elites, and stop mindlessly fueling these culture wars in a way that just plays into the hands of the far right, which has been using the same culture wars move again and again and again and again, and we just don't get it. So the book is trying to explain what that culture war move is, how it's related to class, and what's the counter strategy.
You outlined briefly some of the reasons why Trump voters and others are so angry at people like us. But I wonder if you would say a little bit more about the economic analysis that you provide in the book, because it's one of the strongest parts of the book. I think it'll be
that's
impossible.
A compliment coming from Jim.
It'll be, I think, easy for people who read just a review of the book or know only, say, what Eric said at the beginning, to assume that your solution simply is for us to use different language, for us to be less condescending, stop using words like stupid and racist. But there are plenty of reasons why people are angry.
Yeah.
And the short version is they got screwed.
Yeah.
The longer version is what happened
Yeah.
from the 70s through the 90s into the 21st century to suck the economic life out of the heartland.
Yeah. I mean, we all know that neoliberalism, by which I mean free trade, let the markets be unfettered and they will raise all boats. Let the markets be unfettered and China will become a democracy because such is the power of capitalism. I mean, it was a pretty sexy idea. It didn't work. We all know that neoliberalism was accompanied by radical growth in income inequality. And that's a lot of what's fueling economic populism. Basically, there's this, I read all of this economics and political science. Oh my God, not fun. But there's this guy named Kerr, and what he documented is if you look at the effect of globalization on different deciles, it's so nice to be in Cambridge so I can actually say things like deciles. The deciles of population that globalization really helped were largely in Asia. I mean, we raised so many millions and millions of people out of poverty. It's kind of awesome. The deciles that got screwed were the middle class in developed countries. And that is the basic economic infrastructure of far-right populism. But the other thing that I was really thinking about a lot as I read this book is that neoliberalism didn't just increase inequality among individuals, it increased equality among regions. And remember Richard Florida, who was so excited about the creative class and the superstar cities? A huge proportion, something like 75%, if I remember correctly, of job growth in this neoliberal period was focused on a few superstar cities. And what's the matter with Kansas? Kansas wasn't one of those superstar cities. And so you have this toxic combination of people who are very identified with the place they grew up. I don't know this, probably can't find the statistic quickly, but a huge proportion of Trump voters live within 2 hours of where they grew up. People are very rooted, very place loyal, very proud of their hometown. And those hometowns have been gutted. I mean, the kids can't stay. There's no jobs there. There's no jobs for the adults. You put men together with unemployment and you get impotence and you get drugs, and that's what you have. So that's the opioid epidemic. These places are just gutted, and people look around and they feel that their futures have been gutted. And that's one of the reasons why, to frame what Democrats are about, as was in the 20 and 24 campaign, as defense of democracy. These people feel democracy failed them for a really simple reason. Democracy failed them. And so for us to be talking only about defense of democracy and Trump to be talking about inflation, kitchen table issues in the economy, I mean, what did we think was going to happen?
Okay, one more question, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. And this is a very difficult question to answer. If I knew the answer, I wouldn't be asking the question. But how can the United States build jobs in the age of automation and AI for high school graduates? What kind of transformation will be necessary in order to deal with the legitimate sources of anger that people feel?
Yeah, I mean, and this is the delight in talking with old friends. I never quite figured this out until Jim and I had the prep call for this panel. When you think about it, so much of the focus in terms of getting jobs back has been on good blue-collar jobs. Sort of, does this remind us of centering the masculine just a little bit? After our conversation, manufacturing is not going to play the same role in the economy that it did in the 70s. And the US is not going to play the same role in manufacturing that it did in the 70s and the 60s, 40s and 50s and 60s. Manufacturing is now highly automated. Even when these factories are coming back, they're not going to offer that many jobs. As many jobs as they used to. That said, tariffs aren't the way, but we should have a lot more manufacturing. And during the pandemic, we realized that it was just, even for simple national security reasons, we needed to onshore things and to reshore our basic supply chains in basic ways. So, the setting up, as we've talked about, the goal of corporate life to make as much money as humanly possible for shareholders, as if shareholders weren't the only stakeholders, that were the only stakeholders. The business ideology that began with Milton Friedman is part of the problem. Workers are also a really important stakeholder. We see that now that the workers are so mad that the government is so irrational that it's destroying the business climate and national security. I mean, I feel like a 1990s Republican someday. Like, don't do that to the bond market, Don't cut the CIA. This is not a stable business climate. That is not sensible. And I'm hoping that even the merchant right will come to realize that, quite in addition to the Brahmin left. But blue-collar jobs are only part of what we're talking about here. We're also talking about the fact that wages for people in pink-collar jobs, wages for the tire salesman in routine white-collar jobs, all of those jobs also are radically underpaid. And we just need to realize that if we're going to live, and this is something that Germany realized after World War II. that if you want to live in a stable democracy, particularly in a really racist culture, you got to have stable jobs for the middle class. Because if you don't, things get really, really ugly and they get really, really irrational. And that's where we are now.
Okay, thank you. Elliot, you're on.
Early in the 21st century, we had lots of scholars talking about what they call intersectionality. They were going to tie together race, gender, and class. But I've found that so much of that scholarship doesn't do a lot with class, I find, but you can correct me. But I'd like to hear a little bit about your thoughts on the left critics of, I'll say in shorthand, of wokery. You have people like Catherine Liu, who's always writing about the professional managerial classes. Adolph Reed, a lot about countering race determinism, and he often talks about the wokery problem from his left-wing vantage point. And there's others, but I'd like to hear whether you pay attention to a lot of their left critiques, and also just your thoughts about what I think went wrong with intersectionality, but maybe I'm being unfair to them.
Well, you just heard intersectionality. Everything I said was about intersectionality. I mean, it's gotten a bad rap, and one of the things that the right is really good at is glomping onto a word like that and demonizing it. So I do think it's important. I think race, class, and gender are really, really important, not the only vectors of social power, but the most important ones in the United States. And I think it's important to look at things simultaneously from all three standpoints. They're incommensurable standpoints, but they're all important. So that said, the way we talk makes us a target. Because when you think about intersectionality, Latinx, Latina, all of these things, I once joked that my book Unbending Gender, which was written 25 years ago, was Judith Butler, but in English. I have what there began in gender studies and in all of these critical theory influenced disciplines, a tradition of inventing new language. Now, we were doing it for damn good reasons. We've already talked about the unspoken masculine, and that's why Latinx was invented, in order not to reinscribe the unspoken masculine. And so I understand why we did it, but we have to, our lack of a class lens bars us from understanding how people are going to hear it. They don't hear it as admirably analytical smashing the hegemony. They hear it as elites' fancy talk telling them they're stupid. Intersectionality has been demonized for the same reason. I think, Jim and I both come from John Dewey. You can say anything, folks, in plain language. And a lot of this specialized language is really elites using sophistication to raise their social status with other elites. That's why this fancy talk is so prevalent. And I think we have to understand, once you really begin to take class seriously, which you're right, a lot of the race, class, and gender stuff doesn't, I think. Once you develop an ear that's attuned to how this is going to be heard by people who didn't go to college, and on the assumption that they're just as smart as you, they just have different talk traditions, we're going to stop using so much of this fancy language. If you're smart enough to think it up, you're smart enough to say it in English that any ordinary person can understand.
Hi, thanks so much for being with us. My name is Laura, and I'm graduating from Harvard Law School next week.
Congratulations.
I grew up in a working class neighborhood in Miami where a lot of people work for Trump and love Trump and what he's about. And I went to Brown undergrad and now I'm here. So I've had a very different experience just being an observer of class in a lot of different settings. I'm curious, sort of, if you think that universities have a role to play in this. I think universities play such a huge role in the US and have so much power. And I think, like, for me, being a working class student, like showing up at Brown my first day, it was very obvious that I would have to fall in line and adopt a lot of these ways of speaking and acting and behaviors and just like kind of blend in
Yes.
the new place where I was.
We could even say pass.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I don't think universities do a good job of making sure that, you know, the students who are from elite backgrounds
Yeah.
are understanding the communities that they're now in and even leaving their campuses. And I think that universities should do way better. And I'm curious if you talk about that in the book or if you have some ideas.
I actually talk about that in a prior book called Reshaping the Work-Family Debate, Why Men in Class Matter. And I talk a lot there about people like you, who I call class migrants, because it's almost this, it's analogous to being a migrant from a different country, because you're basically leaving one culture and going to another. And actually thinking about maybe writing my next book. So give me your email, interview book, talking to class migrants. It's a really interesting sort of social positionality, because what many people find is, first of all, they are faced with these institutions that are very rigorously class, performing a certain class location without knowing it. And yet the first generation students see it all the time, and they're faced with these uncomfortable choices about whether to pass or whether to not. The other thing, though, that makes being a class migrant so challenging is often your parents, actually, I was giving a talk at the Kennedy School for this book, and I was talking about class migrant and the pain of being a class migrant, and how many times your parents are really, really proud of you and also kind of feel a little betrayed, like, you know, where their life wasn't good enough. And I was talking about this, and one young woman, a young African-American woman at the Kennedy School, came up to me after and just started to cry. And she said, nobody has ever talked about this element of my experience. And one of the reasons it's such a malpractice that race, class, and gender so rarely actually talks about class is, you know, 2/3 of first generation college students are people of color. You cannot help even people of color if you don't talk about class. And I think the sort of class cluelessness that is so common in the elite makes life very, very difficult for first generation college students. And that's one of the reasons they don't want to go to college. And they especially don't want to come to Harvard, because they know that they'll feel very out of place. They'll often hear very condescending and insulting things about where they came from, and it's very painful. Hey, Rebecca.
We ordered the weather up just to make sure you knew you were still.
My family's from Vermont.
What do you think of the AOC Bernie tour around the red states?
Yeah. I actually am desperately, if anybody has any help, trying to publish an op-ed saying Republican donors are smart enough to know they have to tolerate anti-elitist rhetoric. Democratic donors need to wise up. You notice the anti-oligarchy tour drew large crowds in red states from two very economically progressive candidates. That ain't no mistake. That ain't no accident, folks. That ain't no fact. There is lots of research, anti-elitist rhetoric is very, very strong and appealing, which is one of the reasons why Rupert Murdoch was all over it. He's so smart. Um, Kamala Harris actually did start out using some anti-elitist rhetoric. That speech in North Carolina where she's talking about price gouging, but eventually she got the message that there were some donors that were not very happy about that. And she backed off and focused on abortion rights and defense of democracy. And there's actually a really interesting Ezra Klein show where he was talking to a brilliant guy named David Shore, a Democratic operative. And David Shore, and it's funny, I've talked to so many, consultants and pollsters, and what a lot of them tell me off the record, and David Shore kind of said it a little bit on the record, which is, donors come to him and they're all about defense of democracy. Like, this Trump is outrageous and he did this and you got to go polling and he does the polling doesn't work. Do more polling. There is a study of Silicon Valley entrepreneurs in 2017 that showed what kind of liberals they were. They were all for redistribution and probably universal basic income, but they were really rabidly against unions and labor rights. So in other words, let us make our billions and then we'll give a few little crumbs to the poor. But don't change a labor system where up to 1/3 of our workers are full-time employees who are treated as casual employees. So I think the Democratic donors have to get comfortable with anti-elitist rhetoric if they don't want to lose. And people were saying to me, I've been on, I've done tons of press recently, and, aren't we going to, this will never end so long as corporate Democrats. They have corporate Republicans. They use anti-elitist rhetoric. I mean, just get smart. This is, you have to use this. And there's a lot of elegant data in the book that shows that it's very effective rhetoric and it's very effective as a wedge issue to wedge working class Republicans away from corporate Republicans.
Hi, thank you so much for this talk. I have a couple of thoughts. One is related to the question about intersectionality, and what I was thinking as I was listening to both of you, and mostly you, Joan, talking, is that it sounds like this is speaking mostly about white working class people. No.
No.
Well,
no, it isn't.
I have thoughts
Definitely
about
is
that
not.
in terms of work
No.
I've done as a sociologist and thinking about.
There, just to clear the record here, I know that you didn't mean it that way, but I'm just a little sensitive about this. So the first chapter is, if I could open the book, is there really a diploma divide? The second chapter is it just the white working class? So no, it is not. It is not just the white working class, and that's what we saw last election.
Yeah, so I'd love you to speak a little bit more to that, because then there was commentary about the heartland, and it conjures, I love the language and sort of the collapsing into this idea of the white working class in the middle, as opposed to, obviously the working class is all over this country in urban areas and suburban areas, and go across race and gender, and so that was one thing. But then I'm also thinking a lot about, as somebody who grew up poor, identifies as working class, only person in my family to go to college, I'm very sensitive to all of the things that you're talking about in terms of the elitism, the language, the posturing, the cultural aspects of it. And I guess I've been trying to think about too the evolution of culture and language, and the ways even around race and the language people have used to refer to different groups of people of color, and how that has changed over time. And it wasn't comfortable necessarily, and there are plenty of white people that didn't like it, and didn't like that we were desegregating schools, water fountains, etc. So to what degree do we co-sign a sort of persistent racism when it's being conflated with class, instead of focusing also on the overwhelming majority of people who didn't vote at all, right? There's this preoccupation with the working class that voted for Trump, and I get it, that's something I'm very interested in, but there are many more people who didn't vote, and we don't know we're sort of making assumptions about what people's motivations were to some degree who voted for Trump. Is it their racism? Is it economic? But what can we learn from the people who didn't participate?
Well, I mean, some of the most shocking things about the 2024 election were first the veer of voters of color away from Democrats. So that's, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But another incredibly shocking thing is that voters under $50,000 veered for Trump. That didn't used to happen. And even more sobering, low propensity voters veered for Trump. So greater turnout would probably have meant we would have lost more on the heroic assumption that we're all Democrats. After the 2016 election, it was like, oh, we just have to get our people out. Well, if there had been more people out, we would have lost worse in 2024. But the veer of people of color away from Democrats, if you this is like what used to be called the emerging American electorate. If you compare 2012 to now, non-college people of color have shifted away from Democrats by 35 points. Non-college Latinos by 35 points. Non-college Black Americans by 30 points. The shift has been even larger among the young, the Pippa Norris and the whole thing of like every generation is just more liberal and the old people are dying off and it's just the backlash, but pretty soon they'll be dead. No, that also was disproven by 2024. There's this big veer of young people, chiefly men, but also women, towards Trump. In my view, by the way, that's the economic opportunity. Younger college grads now, inequality has gotten so bad that they can't achieve a stable middle-class standard of living either. They can't afford houses. They can't afford childcare. There was one article I quote in the book called "It Sucks to Be 33." That's the economic opportunity, or that's the political opportunity to marry the anger of the missing middle with the anger of the rising younger college grads who are also now not able to achieve a stable middle-class standard of living. But there's just a lot of discussion in the book about why people of color are not as liberal as we like to think they are. And as someone who grew up partly in Venezuela, I always thought that the statement that Latinos were Republicans, they just didn't know it yet, it's an exaggeration, but there's a lot of data, and first generation Latinos are really quite liberal. They are really pretty leftist. By the third generation, you know who they look like? The white working class. And there have been some analyses in the past few years saying that Latinos are the new Italians. I think that's an exaggeration. I think they're only going to be the new Italians if we continue to be stupid. I think that we can turn this around, especially if we lard in the masculinity piece, which we haven't talked about very much. But there's new data out. The initial polling said that found that the gender gap was not larger in 2024. That was exit polling. Turns out to be incorrect. The gender gap was larger in 2024, and the shift of people to Trump was overwhelmingly men. So what's going on here is a lot about masculinity. And again, if you read social psychology, it's not even subtle. Men who feel their masculinity is threatened tend to double down on masculinity. I mean, there's this wonderful Rob Willer study where he, takes people into a lab and he tells some men, you're masculine, other men, you're kind of on the line between masculine and the feminine. And the men whose femininity has been threatened want to buy an SUV and support the Iraq War, and they're like, they're doubling down on masculinity like crazy. So there's all these masculinity threats. And guess whose masculinity is threatened? Men who can't be providers. Something like 70% of the American public believes that it really works better if the man, don't quote me on that, but I'm pretty sure that I remember that. It's in the book, and it's accurate in the book. And then there was Me Too. There's been a lot of cultural stuff where women have inched up in power, and that has made being a young man very scary. And young men, the young men are hurting crew. There is something there. Again, though, class blindness enters in, because the young men who are really hurting, they are the non-college men. The men who still rule the world, they are the high elite, and they are still overwhelmingly white men.
We've got time for one more.
Thank you for the talk. I was wondering, you spoke a little bit, I guess you spoke a little bit about the concessions that various elite groups have given to white constituents, or I guess working class constituents or working class members of society, and you've outlined very clearly how that happens on the right. I mean, giving some kind of cultural sway to,
Yeah.
Excuse me.
Traditional cultural values.
Yeah, additional cultural values to the working class on their platform. And I'm wondering what kind of, sway should be granted to working class in the Democrat platform.
Yeah.
How we manage those types of concessions.
This is a great question. It's answered in the chapter in the book on gay marriage. If you think about it, as someone who's worked, been a social justice warrior for like 40 years, count them, really the only really dramatic change I have seen in that entire period is gay marriage. Now, there's a lot of reasons for that, but one of the reasons is because that I talked to one of the architects of the gay marriage campaign, Matt Cole, who's a colleague of mine, who ran the ACLU's Marriage Equality Project. And he said that, and it's very well documented, and I knew it because these were my folks. The gay liberation movement thought marriage was like for the birds. It's like, who would want that, pathetic patriarchal institution? Their goal was the valorization of a wide range of sexualities and a complete reorganization of intimacy and respect of wide range of intimacies. That was their goal. And so how did they get to gay marriage? Well, many of them were really bent out of shape, I have to say. They were not pleased. And I asked Matt, why did you guys go there? And he said that was because that was what our people wanted. After he told me the story that after they got domestic partnerships in California, one of the county clerks arranged a big party for the first day where you could go and tie the knot, and she had like heart balloons and tables, and she organized a procession down a grand staircase for everybody who wanted it. Matt told me, let me just read this quote. He said, first I wasn't even going to go. I thought, this is performative. I'm just not interested. But then he said, the people coming down the stairs were not doctors or lawyers. They were ordinary, average people. And he said, I get it now. It's the prom and the wedding ceremony and everything rolled into one. They're finally able to say, yeah, Mom, I got married. Now, to quote my husband, many people don't want to smash the hegemony, they just want to join it. And if your social honor is often defined by your ability to participate in these kinds of institutions, as it is for many of this missing middle, that's what they wanted. And then so Matt and other elite gatekeepers changed their priority. They changed what they, now they didn't give up, a la Roy Tahira and Liberal Patriot. They didn't just follow working class values, to your point. But they did say, I'm trying to build a coalition here. I'm not interested in an echo chamber because an echo chamber doesn't get to me where I want to be, which is I want people, gay people, to be respected as dignified human beings who make dignified choices. And in order to achieve that goal, they ceded power to non-elites. Now, what we often think of is then Matt raised a lot of money and held focus groups and also changed messaging. They changed the messaging to commitment because they asked ordinary people what marriage meant to them. And that's what came up again and again. But all those people who spent all that money and all those donors who spent all this money on changing messaging, the only reason they could change messaging is because they listened to what people wanted, people whose lives were fundamentally different from theirs. And they said, it's important to me, I'm not going to back off of gay rights, but I am going to pursue this goal in a way that's going to work because I'm going to listen to my people. That's the model.
Well, with that, an enormous thank you to Joan C. Williams.